2013, election fever is at its peak, with a dynamic duo that is perceivably in the lead having ICC cases hanging over their heads like the proverbial axe just waiting to fall. In a telephone interview, Assistant US Secretary of State Johnny Carson feels the need to remind Kenyans that choices have consequences as we prepare for the ballot. This is a mantra that has been repeated over and over and over again, perceivably to remind ourselves about the consequences of decisions that we make, especially around electioneering periods. Yet somehow, despite our collective psyche to do better, we still end up making the same mistakes that we make every electioneering cycle. In our presuppositions of free and fair elections and sober governance after, it has come to my realization that there's things that we are usually very oblivious about that help us make the fundamental decisions of what happens at the ballot. The unseen hands that bank on our patterns of mediocrity and continue to vandalize our democracy by taking away our chances and choices and thrive off of it, that limit what you know and therefore what you can choose. The absolute epitome of asymmetrical information. They come in many forms: errant lobby groups, neocolonialist tendencies, elitism, corruption, but then there's a mother of them all, the one biggest threat to modern day democracy as we know it: corporate capture. More politically correct, corporate political activity. Simply, the intentional watering down, or rather the intentional use of power and influence that big corporates, private entities and businesses have to influence decision-making apparatuses of the states, policy makers, for example, law enforcement and legislation. Covax, COVID-19 Global Access Initiative, was hailed as our biggest ticket towards ensuring equitable vaccine distribution in our most vulnerable moment as humanities during the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet somehow, despite their also noble mandate, over close to 100 countries rather are yet to receive even a single dose of vaccines. Yet somehow, all the Western countries have received enough vaccines to vaccinate their entire population twice over. Some of the most fundamental bits of democracy and independence are enshrined in the following questions. What power do you have? Who gave it to you? Whose interests do you serve? To whom do you account? And most of all, how can we get you out of there? Covax. What is your mandate, or rather, what power do you have? Equitable distribution of vaccines across the world. Okay. Who did you get it from? That is a little bit in the gray areas, considering the fact that Covax is constituted primarily of 5 big pharmaceutical companies that have been proven to over and over again put corporate interests before anyone else's interests. Of course, WHO has a significant share, or some level of share in Covax, but it's just there for razzle-dazzle. Number 3, whose interests do you serve? Western countries have enough vaccines to serve their populations twice over, yet a country like Chad, a country that is most definitely in need of vaccines, has yet to see a single vaccine months in. To whom do you account? The running at Covax has been accredited to 2 major organizations, rather bodies, the Vaccine Alliance and Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, none of whom legally account to anyone but their financiers. So who do you account to? Their financiers. There is no other modality of accountability in this particular body. How do we get rid of you? You can't. You didn't even choose them. What does Covax show you? Independent institutions like WHO that derive their mandate from treaties that have been signed, legal avenues, have been unable to insulate themselves against the sticky tentacles of corporate capture. Covax being a prime example of how, despite the full magnitude of the job at hand, corporates have still found a way to skew the scales in their favor, life be damned. That is perhaps the biggest pandemic that we face currently towards our democracies and us as people in general. That corporate political activity has the ability to compromise independent institutions that seemed incorruptible. The question then becomes, how much worse susceptible systems like our own? In the memorial of the late Chris Kirubi, the business magnate, the former deputy governor of Nairobi, Polycarp Igathe, had some very interesting sentiments to say. chairman, as he was fondly known amongst his peers, designed the Sonko Igathe ticket. Furthermore, when business became hard to do in Nairobi, it is Chris Kirubi that engineered the return of Nairobi to the national government. Seemingly harmless sentiments that were supposed to create the illusion of a very significant contribution to society, except for one thing. As politics continued to play out, it became significant, or rather it became apparently clear, that the whole role of the Deputy Governor Polycarp Igathe was the government's reassurance. He was the government's reassurance to the business community in Nairobi that Sonko, the people's choice, would be kept on a leash. Now let's rephrase that. A protege of the late Chris Kirubi was brought in at Chris Kirubi's desire to act as a leash to the popular choice of the people, the majority choice, Governor Sonko, for the sake of a small business community that, of course, Chris Kirubi must have been part of, and effectively trivialize the choice of the greater majority. At this point, it's imperative for me to mention a couple of things. It is understandable that there are people who had concerns about the ability of the seemingly volatile governor to rule a city as significant as Nairobi, the hub of business, not just in Kenya, but East Africa and the continent at large, despite him being the popular vote. And as such, it was in the best interests of us as a country to have someone who was perceivably more stable to be shadowing the popular vote. So our gratitude should ideally be to the corporate world, right? Wrong. First of all, hardly ever do corporate interest and personal interest, or rather interest of the people on the ground, align. This was a once in a blue moon phenomenon. And second, the nature of democracy is that it is applied in its entirety all the time, convenience notwithstanding. And as such, you do not compromise or vandalize democracy when you feel like it is inconvenient based off of the people's decisions. That is the whole essence of democracy. Furthermore, democracy has been proven over time to be self-correcting. It does not operate in a vacuum. Through laws, you have avenues like impeachment and votes of no confidence. So ideally, Nairobi still would have been perfectly fine if democracy was allowed to play out, but it didn't. This is not an isolated example. Just how deeply entrenched are the roots of corporate capture in the Kenyan government? How able are corporates to influence policy decisions, governance decisions, and generally shut out the greater majority's interests from spaces where the voices actually matter? Plywood is a commodity whose uses we're not short of. Construction, furniture making, ideally, it features in a lot of the things that we use on a day-to-day basis. Yet somehow, for close to half a century, one family has dominated the plywood business and made it a near monopoly. Attempts to break this monopoly were done by the importation of high-quality Chinese plywood into the market some time back. Interestingly enough, shortly after this was done, in the 2018 budget reading, a plywood tax import duty tax was introduced. Now the most interesting part is, around that time, there was a bill that was prohibiting logging of wood, which ideally made plywood rather, become a commodity that was rather hard to access. Which begs the question, why then put such punitive taxes at a time when the country needs its highest input of wood? Nairobi is expanding, and so are other capital cities, or rather so are other cities, and as such, there is greater demand for wood. Yet somehow the government seems to compromise that by putting an import tax. The idea was to effectively kill competition and maintain the same monopoly. Did it work? Clearly it did. Imported vegetable oils also faced a similar fate. Somehow, there was an import duty imposed, and when you look at it, you will realize that the same family actually features significantly in the business of imported, or rather in the business of vegetable oils, locally produced vegetable oils. They not only dominate the oil industry and the plywood industry, they dominate sugar, as was seen during the Mercury Saga scandal in 2018. They also dominate paper. Now here's the most interesting thing. This one family was able to offload a poorly performing pan paper from the government at 900 million shillings. Now that sounds like a very significant amount, but mark you, a valuation of the pen paper assets, despite its poor performance, shows a record of not less than 18 billion shillings in terms of assets. You will continue to buy oil, vegetable oil, at obscene prices. Furniture will continue to shoot through the roof in terms of prices because corporates have found a way to compromise governance through policy, through law formulation, and through outright arm twisting. It gets more personal. Recently, a lot of people found their details, their very private details, used to register them for political parties they had no say in. How does all this feed into the bigger picture of corporate political activity? Stay tuned for part 2.